We're going to go ahead and get started. People will join us as they come in. Dan, you ready?
Here you go.
All right, tell us where you are.
Okay, so I am at my home, and I want to introduce you guys to a recent addition to our family. This is one of our chickens. She is now 3 weeks old, and we're going to talk a little bit about what it takes to successfully keep chickens at your home, why you should do it, and some of the benefits that come with keeping chickens. I want to share mostly from my personal experience today, and I want to start just by saying that there are so many different ways of working with chickens, keeping chickens. So everything I say should be taken with a grain of salt. And certainly, I only have limited experience. You know, I've been keeping chickens on my home here not very long at all. I've also kept chickens at various farms that I've worked with over the years. But there's a lot that I don't know, so I'll do my best to answer your questions. And I'll tell you mostly from my experience what works and what doesn't. But please feel free to write in questions. And if you're having trouble hearing me, let us know in the chat as well. We are near a major road here, so there's a fair amount of background noise. So if at any point you need me to speak up, just let me know and I'm happy to do so. So let's talk about the chicken. I'm assuming a lot of you are here today because either you like chicken or eggs, or because you're thinking about having some chicken as pets, more or less. So I want to tell you how to go about doing that. So we're going to cover everything from housing to feeding them to making sure predators don't get your birds, and some of the options about how to get started, making sure that they work for you in the best way possible and that you're able to provide them with the best life possible. And that's really where I want to start. So first of all, actually, let me just give you a bit of background about the chicken. So chickens come from Southeast Asia. Humans have been domesticating chickens for about 5,000 years. That's quite a long time. They're one of the most widespread livestock domesticated animals in the world. And you can find chickens on every continent except for Antarctica at this point. And they're very adaptable. And humans have been domesticating them to meet a variety of different needs. So along the way, we've split up breeds that are better for meat versus ones that are better for eggs. We found breeds that are really good at foraging. We found breeds that are really good at staying indoors. So really wide range of traits that you choose from. We'll talk a little bit more about breeds later on. But I think I want to start with where they're from because it's important to get a sense of what an animal's native conditions are like so that we can do our best to mimic those conditions. Certainly, we are very far from the jungle of Southeast Asia here in Northampton, but we can do our best to find some of those conditions for them. So jungle conditions means that they want to be in shade. They like tree cover. They like really rich composty soils. And somewhere to put on a branch. So some of those conditions are what we're trying to meet here in our yard. And one of the reasons that I keep chickens is because I'm really trying to limit my endorsement of factory farming. Most chickens that you get, particularly conventional chickens, even if they are labeled free range, are oftentimes raised in really abominable conditions, extremely close proximity, with no access to outdoors, no access to play, which is actually really important for chickens. And just conditions that really create aggression, create disease. And so what we're trying to do here in our house is to create conditions that are going to create really happy birds, because ultimately happy birds means that they're going to be healthier and they're going to provide nutritional eggs and meat. And here at our house, we're actually raising chickens for both meat and eggs. We're going to show you both kinds here today. And that's, I think that's really important to note that when you raise chickens in your own yard, you are going to get much, much higher quality eggs or meat, depending on what you're going for, than you can get in a grocery store. You can get same quality if you're going for local farms. Usually they're raising birds in a really, really good manner too. But of course, when you're raising them yourself, you can control everything, right? You know what they're being fed, how much space they have access to, all of those conditions that are really important for happiness in a bird is something that you can control when you have them at home. It's not just about food though. When you raise birds, there are so many other benefits. And in permaculture, we talk a lot about stacking functions, meaning that every element in a system has to meet more than one need, has to yield more than one output. Chickens are fantastic at doing so. Not only do they provide us with meat and eggs, but they also help create incredible quality compost. They provide so much fertility. They're always cycling nutrients. So if you don't want to be creating compost in your yard, you can just give them food scraps and they will turn it into really high quality fertilizer for your garden, for your lawn, for whatever your ornamental plants, whatever you might have. They also provide really good entertainment. I have a 4-year-old at home and he is really loving taking care of the chicken. It's really the first time that he feels a sense of ownership, that he feels some pride, because he really feels like these are his birds and he has to take care of them. And I really feel like that's already starting to show. I could sense that he's taking a sense of ownership and that it's really building character for him. So I'm really happy to do that. I'm also just learning a lot about behavior of animals by observing them every day. I hang out with my chickens maybe half an hour every day. And that time for me is really precious because I really get a sense of what are they doing? Are they healthy? How are they playing? And it's also a really good time for me just to kind of unwind, de-stress. I find that holding a chicken like I'm doing right now, they're nice and warm, feel their heartbeat. There's something just really relaxing about it. And knowing that you're providing them with a really good home is just really satisfying. So those are some of the benefits of providing chickens, of housing chickens in your own backyard. And it really is quite easy. I would say that chickens are probably the easiest of all livestock. Possibly, there are ducks and other small livestock that are probably about as easy, but these are much, much easier if you're thinking about, let's say comparing them to goats or sheep or certainly cattle. Chickens require very little space, very little time, energy, and effort. And I want to tell you some tips today about how to keep chickens in a way that's really going to fit in with our busy modern lifestyles. Because most of us don't want to be spending hours a day keeping our livestock. So I want to tell you about how to integrate this in a way that makes sense for busy people. I'm certainly a very busy person. I've got a 4-year-old and I have a child on the way in about 2 months. So I'm really thinking about how to minimize the amount of time while also making sure that they're happy and healthy and that we are able to really interact with them in a way that makes sense for us. So let's start with how to get started with chickens. There's some choices you're going to have to make really early on in the process and a few pieces of information you need to know right away before you get started. So the first thing you really need to know are some of your town regulations. It is important to know what is legal in your town, and every town is different. So some towns don't allow any chickens at all at homes. Some towns have a cap of 6 or 10 or 12 chickens. Some towns allow roosters, some towns don't allow roosters. Some towns it's split up by zoning sections. So in some zones, like in agricultural zones, they may allow as many hens as you want or roosters, and other, more residential areas, they may have limits. And some towns have absolutely no zoning regulations, and you can keep whatever you want, as many as you want. It's also important to note that some regulations have setbacks, meaning that you won't be able to keep your coop or your run close to a property line. So that's really important to note as well. So really important to know that. The easiest way of finding out, I want to share a resource with you. You can Google this. I also can share a link with you later on after this video. If you Google NOFA Mass, NOFA-MASS, urban poultry, NOFA Mass urban poultry, it'll bring you to a page of the Northeast Organic Farming Association of Massachusetts. And they have some really good resources where it goes town by town and tells you exactly what the rules are in your town. Now, it's important to note that actually I used to work for NOFA Mass, which is why I'm sharing that resource. And I actually did a lot of work advocating for towns, for people who wanted to change their regulations. And unfortunately, there's a lot of myths that go into these regulations. And so if your town has regulations that you think are too restrictive, let's say they don't allow backyard birds, or they limit it to 3 or 6, and you think that that's unnecessary, there are oftentimes special permits that you can get. And there's also advocacy work that you can do to actually change your town rules. I helped many citizens who had backyard flocks or wanted them actually advocate and change those rules. It is very, very possible to do that. And I really encourage you, because a lot of these rules are extremely old. Nobody's bothered with them. Nobody's looked at them for a long time. And if we're talking about food security, having backyard birds is key, right? A bird like this will lay 1,000+ eggs in her life, assuming she lives to at least 3 or 4 years old or more. So that's a lot of eggs. That's just from one bird. Or of course, if you're raising them for meat, that's also more food security. So there's really little else we can do, even more so than growing your own vegetables or fruit. This is real food security right here. So important, I think, that we do that advocacy work and finding out what your regulations are. So check that out. Again, there are other websites that keep these tallies, but for Massachusetts specifically, that's a great resource, nofamass.org. And I think if you just look at their urban poultry page, you'll find everything you need there. Some great resources to check out. So know what your regulations are. And then second step, I would generally talk to your neighbors. Let them know what your plans are. Usually, your neighbors will be on board, especially if you address their concerns early on. Let them know, do you have any concerns? And if they bring up, oh, is there going to be a smell? Are they going to be loud? There's some great fact sheets that you can find on that same website, UMass, that will dispel a lot of those myths. So for example, if they think they're going to be really loud, you can let them know, well, I'm only going to be getting hens, laying hens, such as this bird right here. Laying hens are only as loud as humans. It's only roosters that can be quite loud, right? So if you're not getting roosters, you can dispel that myth right away. If they're concerned about the smell, let them know how you're going to be managing. And we're going to be talking about how to manage manure so that you don't have smell issues, which makes for good neighbors. Also, you may want to let them know, I'm happy to share my eggs. And that's really one of the best benefits I find of having chickens, is it really does create community. In my neighborhood here, we're a quite fairly agricultural neighborhood. We have a lot of people around here who keep chickens, and often give away their eggs or sell them to neighbors, especially actually during this pandemic. We have a listserv here, and a lot of people have been mentioning, we have eggs, come by, buy them, they'll be on our front porch. And people have been so appreciative. There's really nothing like that gift economy that you can create by offering fresh foods such as eggs, right? And if you have chickens, you're almost always gonna have extra eggs. Even if you have just 6 chickens, which is, a fairly small flock, you're gonna be at the height of their laying for the first few years, they're gonna be producing just about 1 egg a day, depending on the breed and the time of year. That's a lot of eggs, right? 6 eggs a day is more than most people or even small families can eat. So you'll have plenty to give away. You'll make a lot of friends. You might be able to create some barter economies in the process. So an excellent way of bridging those neighborhood gaps. So talk to your neighbors early on. If you have some neighbors that aren't fully on board, or if you know that they're definitely not going to be on board, well, you might have to get a little more creative. Maybe you don't let them know ahead of time and get some chickens, and then once they're there, you can explain. You might have to really kind of finagle that. You know your neighbors better than I do, so you can kind of think about what the politics of that will look like in your neighborhood. But in general, I find that talking to your neighbors early on is best, to let them know so there's no surprises. Yeah.
Is part of the regulation that your neighbors have to be in agreement that
Not usually. That's
okay.
a great question. Not usually. It does depend. There are a few towns that have regulations where the neighbors can kind of stifle that process in the permitting stage. And I should mention that there are some towns that do require permits, which might cost something like $25, so that you can register your birds. That way the Board of Health knows where you're keeping birds. They might take a look at the housing to make sure it's safe, that it's healthy, that it's proper. So that's important to note as well in the regulations. You can easily find that in your zoning bylaws. You look up your town or on that UMass website. But in general, your neighbors don't have to be on board, but there might be setbacks of 25 or 50 feet from your neighbor's property line. So do make sure you check that out. Know where that line is, and if you have to have a setback.
I'm also noticing how that chicken is just so calm this whole time as you're holding it. Did you have to do anything special to get such a calm chicken?
No, so actually funny you should ask. It wasn't very easy for me to actually hold this chicken. We're gonna go into my coop in just a minute. These are only 3-week to 4-week-old chickens. Very, very young. At this stage, they're usually not very compliant with humans holding them. But the more that you hold them, the more likely they are to become really attached to you, to trust you. And it's gonna be easier for you to hold on to them and to really have a relationship with them, which is really important because when I hold them, first of all, I'm bonding with them, and I can check to make sure that they're healthy, and I can actually warm them up a little bit too. So I'm kind of acting a little bit like a mama hen right now, which is really, they appreciate. So when I first caught her, she wasn't very happy with it, but now I can tell that she is very much on board with me. She's a little bit scared right now that she hasn't been outside very much in her life. So this is a pretty crazy experience. Imagine being inside really, a shed and then coming out into the wide world. It's a pretty intense experience.
Yeah.
But she's handling it very well.
I have somebody asking if your chicken is a cuckoo maran.
Is a what?
A cuckoo maran. Is that the type of
no, so yeah. So let's actually talk about breeds. So there are a lot of different breeds, and that is something that you'll have to decide really early in the process. There are thousands of breeds out in the world. Most of them are not easily commercially available, but certainly even most places where you're going to be getting chickens, they'll have a list of a couple dozen varieties to choose from. This particular breed, I believe, is a rock, a Cornish rock, I believe. And honestly, I can't actually, I definitely have some black Australorps. We'll see those in a minute. And I have some Rhode Island Reds. Those are both what are called dual purpose breeds. So just to zoom out for a second, there's kind of 3 main categories, if you will, of breeds. There are breeds that are meat birds or broilers, which are breeds that grow extremely quickly, really good at gaining weight very, very fast. We're going to look at our meat birds in a little bit. I have Cornish cross meat birds, which is the most common meat bird out in the world. There's a few others that are very common. Then there are dual purpose, which are slower growing than meat birds, fast. They eggs there are layers, which are really just meant for laying eggs. You can eat them as well, but they're not very good at putting on weight quickly, right? So they're not quite as meaty, fatty as other birds. Most of the birds that we have are either dual purpose or the meat birds. We like dual purpose because they still lay a lot of eggs. Most of the chickens that we have that are layers, the dual purpose breeds, are going to be laying between 200, 250 eggs a year for their first 2 years. Once they start to get to a laying age, they're not quite there yet. So you want to know what kind of breed, and then there are some endangered breeds, and some people really care about making sure that those heirloom varieties. So if you're interested in that, you can look into some heirloom breeds that are quite rare nowadays. There are show breeds, which are really meant to be really showy, that are pretty wild looking birds. Some breeds are better foragers than others. So if you're going to be doing a lot of pasturing, I would recommend looking for a breed that is a good forager. That's really important for us. So you might want to, really do a little bit of research about what breed. The most important thing to note, though, is do you want to eat your birds? Do you want to have primarily layers so that you can have eggs. You want them to be primarily foragers and pets for you. So what are your functions? And then once you have that set, you can look at breeds that meet those needs. So really important to note that early on. Now, another important decision you have to make is what age
forager,
bird to buy. Yeah, is there a question?
When you say forager, is that a bird that's going to help you with pest management in your garden, or what exactly does that mean?
Yeah, so foragers, so chickens are omnivores. We'll talk a little bit more about their food later on, but they eat plants, grasses, clovers, weeds, vegetables, fruits, everything. They eat bugs like worms and mosquitoes and ticks. So they do some good pest control, particularly ticks. Mosquitoes they'll eat, but they don't do enough to really limit the mosquitoes in a yard, because mosquitoes, of course, are flying around. But ticks are fairly stationary, so they will do some really good tick control for you. And they'll eat grain and beans, and that's primarily what is involved in commercial feed, which we'll talk about as well. So when I said they're foragers, I mostly mean that they're going to be eating whatever you're giving them, whether it's a grassy area like you see here. We're offering them our grasses, whatever weeds are coming up in our pasture area here. We're also giving them compost, and we're going to look at that system a little bit later on. So it's a little bit of everything, but they really like to be digging for worms and for bugs. That's one of their favorite foods, but they want a balanced diet. So some other bugs, they'll want the grain and beans and other protein sources as well. So balanced diet, but they will really eat almost everything. There are a few things that you shouldn't give your chickens, but I want to talk about food a little bit later on. So let's hold on to that thread a little bit later. So let's talk about just some of the initial decisions to make. So breed is a really important one. The other really important decision to make is what age birds to buy. Now, we decided to buy day-old chicks, hatchlings, as they're also called. That's the cheapest bird. They're $3 or $4 for a bird, but they're also the most work, because when you get them, they are tiny. I mean, we're talking about maybe 3 inches across, and they often come in the mail, or you can buy them from a farm supply store. We got ours from Amherst Farmers Supply, which is very close by. They offer chickens once a year. There are other farm stores like Tractor Supply in Southampton, where you can just go in and buy birds anytime. So there are some advantages and there are disadvantages to buying day-old or very, very young chicks. So that's one category. The next category are what are called pullets. Pullets are birds that are kind of, let's say, in their teenage years. So they're usually between 4 weeks to 16 weeks old or so. They're a little bit bigger than this particular bird. And they are sturdier, right? So they don't require as much intimate care early on as chicks, but they're not laying quite yet. And usually meat birds you're not buying as pullets because meat birds have a very short life cycle. Our meat birds are only going to be around for 8 to 12 weeks. So that's not very long at all. So usually meat birds, you're only getting as chicks. Layers, meaning birds that produce eggs, are either chicks or pullets when you buy them. Pullets are more expensive, but they are close to laying age, and they are really ready to be outdoors. They're ready to really display most of their chickeny behaviors from day one of coming to your house. You can also get mature chicks, which are already laying. Those tend to be ones that you're buying from farms for whatever reason. Maybe they have too many, or somebody is putting them up for adoption, but those are usually quite expensive. I mean, we're talking about maybe $30 to $50 per bird at that stage. So quite expensive, but they're laying as soon as they come to your house. So some advantages there as well. So those are some of the differences. If you do buy chicks, you'll have to have a brooder setup. So with that, I want to take you into my coop we're going to look at our brooder. I also want to talk about housing while we're in there, and we'll look at some of the other chicks that are running around in the coop at the moment. So let's come on in to Coop. All right, so welcome. This is an old tool shed, which has been converted into a chicken coop. Very rustic, not fancy at all, but we were lucky that this tool shed was left by our previous homeowner. We bought this house back in September, so we were more than happy to repurpose this and use it as a chicken coop. And it does the job really well. It stays dry. There's some ventilation. You can see there's a few windows. That's really, really important in good housing. We've been able to create some nice deep litter. We'll talk about that process in a little bit. But really, when it comes to housing, the most important thing is that it's draft-free and yet offers opportunities for ventilation. If you don't have ventilation, it's going to be too hot in the summer, and you're going to have a buildup of ammonia in moisture, which is bad news for your birds. They're going to get sick, and they're not going to be healthy. So you need to have some opportunities for ventilation, especially in the summertime. But really, you need some in the colder months occasionally. So let's take a look at our brooder here. As I mentioned, we bought our chicks at 1 day of age. They were tiny, helpless little chicks. So we built this brooder. This is a little bit fancier than maybe most people are going to use. What most people do for a brooder is basically take a big cardboard box, put some pine or cedar shavings on the bottom for bedding, and they hang a light on the top that's going to provide some food for them. I'm going to let this lady go here. And what a brooder basically does is it keeps the chicks warm for the first several weeks of their life. At the first week, they need to be between 90 and 95 degrees Fahrenheit at most times. And then every week of age, you can reduce their temperature by about 5 degrees. So at week 2, they can be between 85 and 90, week 3, 80 to 85. And so what that usually looks like is either raising the lights or some other way of giving them more space to move so they can get further away from the heat source. The heat, actually, our light is not on here, but what we have is what's called an Ohio brooder. It's a great design, and it lets them kind of self-regulate their temperature, which is why I like this brooder. Underneath here, there are 2 infrared floodlights, which you can get at any hardware store. They're quite cheap. And what we do is at night, for the first week, it was on all the time. Now that it's warmer, we turn it off during the day, but they can come in underneath here and warm themselves up whenever they're cold. And then whenever they're too warm, they'll just run around outside. And that way they can regulate their own temperature. On top here, we just have some straw, and that's acting as a little bit of insulation above the brooder. It kind of keeps the whole thing a little bit warmer and uses a little less electricity. And that is important to note that wherever you're brooding them, you're going to need electricity. We had to run some extension cords out here. A lot of people will brood in a garage or anywhere, even in a spare room, because at that point they are fairly contained if you keep them in a cardboard box. But we wanted to brood them right in their final chicken coop because that way it'll be an easier transition for them as they mature a little bit. So other than the brooder, let's talk about some of the other functions of this coop here. We've got a feeder, and you can get all sorts of different kinds of feeders. This is what's called a hanging feeder or a self-feeding thing, where you can kind of just shake the feed, you load it on top, and it kind of refills quite easily, and then they can come up and peck at it. So again, we'll talk about feed in a minute, but really easy. You can also make one of these on your own. And I do have to refill this, shake it out, usually 2 times a day, but it really depends on how many birds you have. At this point, they have free access to food all day and all night. They can regulate their own food. Not so much true for the meat birds. For them, I do withhold food at night at this point because otherwise they will just eat and eat and eat, and they won't really know how to regulate their own appetite. So I do regulate them a little bit.
So
I also have
separate, Dan? are the meat birds kept separate?
We're going to take a look at them in just a few minutes. They were together when they were brooding. I just separated them out this week. They've actually been separated just for 3 days now. So the meat birds and the layers can be together for a while. But for the most part, meat birds, broilers, I don't like the word meat bird, but there's really no better nomenclature that I can think of. But they're mostly male. And if you let them stay for too long together, they're going to become quite aggressive with their layers, which are females.
Okay.
So we do separate them out, usually once they reach about 3 or 4 weeks of age. And we also have water in here. We have a self-watering 5-gallon container here. It's hung up and it refills. I do have to refill this once or every day or two. And they can come up here and drink water. I do wash this out every morning because you can see otherwise there's wood chips they get in there from their on the ground level. They also sometimes pee or poop in there. I want to keep it clean, so I do empty that water out, put new water in every day or two. And it is really important that they have access to water all the time. You never want them to run out of water. Another couple tips on water is that I recommend adding raw apple cider vinegar, just a tiny splash, tablespoon for every gallon, I believe. Sorry, yeah, half the tablespoon per gallon is what the recommendation. That really does a great job of keeping them healthy. Just like apple cider vinegar is really good for our gut biome, it's really good for the birds as well. So keep some handy, put a dollop in there whenever you think of it, and they'll be really happy for that. The other things we have in this coop, which are really important, are some nesting boxes, which are right over here. The nesting boxes are not currently in use because they're not laying yet. Laying hens will start laying at about 20 weeks of age, so 5 months old. So these girls have about 4 more months to go before they're laying. And at that point, they should be coming in here. What we're going to do is just put some straw in here at that point, just like this. And that's pretty much all they're going to need. The other thing that we might actually put in is some wooden eggs or a ping pong ball. And that actually teaches them, they think it's an egg. So it teaches them, oh, okay, that's where I go to lay eggs. Otherwise, they might just lay wherever they want. In a corner somewhere, who knows, if they're pasturing, they might lay somewhere where you'll never find those eggs. A few times at a farm I used to work at, we found stockpiles of 30, 40 eggs just out near the edge of the field because they were laying eggs there and they were kind of covering them up. So if you don't want that to happen, make sure you teach them early on where to lay. Put a wooden egg, an Easter egg, whatever you have, they will go for it. So that's really simple. And again, they don't really need those for the first 5 months. And the other really important thing is that they have access to grit. This right here is grit. Actually, I think I had a bag of it somewhere. This is basically crushed granite. And you want them to have access to this because this is how they digest their food. They will eat the grit and they store the grit in their gizzard. And when they eat food, they will process it in their gizzard. This grit basically grinds up their food before it enters their intestinal system. So they need that, otherwise they can't digest. If they're being pastured, meaning that they have a lot of access to outdoor space, then they will find their own grit because it's really just pebbles of stone. They find it easily on their own. You don't have to give it to them at that point. But because these birds are still quite young, they're not going outside quite yet. They will be soon enough, but right now, even when we gave them access to outdoor space, they didn't want to go. So they do need this right now. And if you're not sure if they're getting enough grit, just keep some around. You can get it at any feed store, or you can even just buy crushed granite, and they'll go for that too. So really important to have that.
And they needed that right from the start, Dan? Even when they came to
right
day old? Yep.
Yeah, they might not go for it for the first few days, but they will go for it within the first week for sure. The earlier you can get it into their system, the better they'll be digesting food. So definitely really important that you give it to them. Just let them free range it. So leave some out and let them free choice whenever they want. They'll go for it. They go for quite a bit. I have to refill it once every 3 or 4 days, I would say. So those are, one more really important requirement of the coop is perches for them to roost on. as we mentioned, chickens are jungle animals. And in their natural setting in Southeast Asia where they originated, the way that they would sleep or rest is by perching onto a tree branch. That kept them safe from ground predators. So here we mimic that by creating perches where they can jump up, and that's usually where they're going to sleep. And they also just have a really good time playing on perches. A perch is basically a wooden stick that's raised off the ground at whatever level you have. It's nice to have different levels of perches. That way they can get used to it and jump from one to another. Right now, our birds can't reach these top ones. When they're older, they will be able to. But we have a few that are really low to the ground. It's literally just a stick from our yard that we screwed in right along the bottom, a few inches off, and they will jump up there. The earlier you can get them used to perching, the better the happier they'll be, and the easier they'll adjust to perching later on. And it actually keeps them safer later on as well. So really important that you have some perches. They really, really do need it, their natural behavior, so let them play with that. And generally the rule of thumb is you need a foot of perch space per bird. So think, if you have 12 laying hens, you'll need 12 feet of perch space. An important distinction is that meat birds do not perch. They don't need any perching. They actually don't even like to perch. They gain weight so fast that they're not even good at perching. And in fact, someone once told me that perching will actually even toughen up their meat. I'm not sure if that's true, but for the most part, no one I know that raises birds for meat gives them any perching space. And it doesn't seem like they go for it. Even when they were in here, I never saw them perching. So if you're raising them for meat, you don't need any perch space. So I want to talk about how we manage our manure in here. That's a question I get really often is it going to smell? Now, I'm in here right now, and I'll be honest, there is no smell of manure right now. It smells really, really nice. I mean, it doesn't smell floral, but there is no bad smell that I can detect right now at all. So the way that we manage ours is what's called the deep litter system. And if you Google deep litter system for chickens, you will find tons of fantastic resources. But in a nutshell, what we do is we put down 3 or 4 inches of pine or cedar shavings at the very beginning, right when we put in our chicks. And that creates a really good carbon base to absorb all of the nitrogen, the fertility that they're putting down, the poop and pee, right? And as they poop and pee more and more, we add more and more carbon material. And that carbon material can be all sorts of different things. Pine shavings are great, or other wood shavings. Straw or hay is great. Shredded newspaper is fantastic. So whatever you can get your hands on is really, really good. So I'll just show you how we do that. For this round, I ended up buying some cedar shavings. And you can get these at any feed store or farm store or pet store, quite cheap. So every 3 or 4 days when I notice a lot of poop building up, I just go around and I sprinkle some more on. I don't really measuring it or anything like that. I just want to make sure it's nice and covered. And I'm going to do this, I don't know, once a week, whenever I notice that it's starting to maybe smell a little bit. And that really, basically what it's doing is creating the right carbon to nitrogen ratio, which will create good compost in the end.
Dan,
now, when you're starting, it is important. Yeah.
Somebody's asking about the cedar, that they had heard it's bad for baby chicks, about the aromatic oil being bad for their respiratory system.
That is a great question, actually. I've actually, yeah, so I've actually seen, I've also seen that advice before, but, so we use cedar from day one with these chicks, and we did actually have a few losses early on, which I actually don't think was from the cedar. I'll tell you that story in a second. But in my experience, they enjoyed the cedar shavings. But I have read that too, and yet I've also seen a lot of people using them from day one. So that's a good question. I would love to learn more about that. If folks have the experience with cedar shavings, please let me know. Maybe you can write it into the chat because I want to know what others have experienced around that. And I certainly don't have a definitive answer, but a lot of resources that I had come in contact with said, yes, cedar shavings are great from day one. So that's what we've been using. They seem to be pretty happy with that. But if you can get pine shavings, even better. And you can get those for free from a lot of mills, woodworkers, cabinet makers, all sorts of places. So look for those if you need access to that. Great question, and again, I'd love to learn. So let me actually talk about a couple losses that we did have early on. The very first day that we brought the chicks home, it was the first time we'd ever used this coop, because again, we only moved here in September, so we were waiting until the spring to get them in here. And the latch to this coop did not work that first night. I had never ever noticed that the door had ever swung open before. The first morning after we put our chickens in, I came out early in the morning, ready to check on the birds, and I saw the door was flung open. And I gotta tell you, my heart skipped a beat when I saw that. I thought, oh my God, a predator got in, all the chicks are gonna be dead. Luckily, nothing had gotten in, and it was an extremely windy night that night, and our latch hadn't been working properly. And what had happened was the wind had just blew the door right open. It was a pretty cold night. It was April 30th. And I think that the wind just got right in there, and 2 birds ended up perishing over the next couple of days. My sense is that they got too cold, and that's why they didn't make it. And it was really sad. But do note that a lot of times there will be losses if you're starting with day-old chicks. For the first couple days, you may see 1 or 2 perish. It's not unusual, and it's really unfortunate. They gave them a nice burial in the backyard, but unfortunately, there are some issues with health early on. So take a look, make sure they look healthy. The other important thing I want to say about making sure that they're healthy at every stage is looking at their butt, believe it or not. The most common issue that they experience for the first week is what's called pasty butt, where basically they have this kind of like somewhat runny poop for the first week, and occasionally kind of clogs up their valves, their butt, and it can actually prevent them from going to the bathroom. We had a couple issues with that, and basically what we did was we took a wet paper towel and just gently washed them. You can notice it because it's very obvious. It almost looks like there's a big sack of something on their rear end. Very noticeable, easy to catch. Just take a look at them every morning. And if you notice it, just gently wipe with something wet. And after a week, they usually don't have any issues with that. So just keep in mind that that is a possibility. And again, keep in mind that for that first week, you may experience a loss or two. Let's see. So the last thing I want to show you in our coop before we head out is that we keep our commercial feed that we buy from a store in a trash can. Too many times I have seen rodents get into a coop, and they're not looking after the chickens most likely. They're going after the feed. Keep it in a secure container. And while I'm here, I might as well show you what we feed our birds. So the company here, don't pay attention to, but the most important thing to note is that what we're giving them is chick starter / grower food. Really important that you don't get a different kind of food that's appropriate for laying hens, because that has way too much calcium in it, has also a different amount of protein. So when they're young, you want to give them chick starter grower. I believe at around, let's see, different recommendations, but this particular feed says that you can offer this to them until they start laying. So, you can vary that a little bit, but eventually you want to transition them to a laying hen feed, which has a lot more calcium. But for the first several months, 5-ish months, chick starter grower is what you're going for. So this is their primary food right now. Very soon, though, they're going to be able to access forage. That means that we're going to be able to cut down their food, and at least 25%, maybe even half of their food at that point will come from food scraps, pasture, bugs, and anything else that they can get their hands on at that point. So I'm going to put this away. Any questions about housing? I'll show you our outdoor housing in a minute. There's a couple of different areas that we can look at there. But I want to just pause for questions before we move on.
Do folks have any questions right now?
Okay, great. Let's take a look at our meat birds now.
Yeah, we have one
All right,
question.
so,
sorry, Dan.
yeah.
We have one question about the deep litter system. Did you mention how long
Yeah.
it can stay before complete?
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. I didn't quite finish that. So as they keep going, you know, as they keep doing their thing, putting down manure, keep adding some kind of carbon. And usually when it's about a foot deep, usually that's once or twice a year, fall or spring, you do want to empty it out. And at that point, it's going to be mostly composted, and you can put it right out into your garden, or you can make a big pile with it and let it break down a little bit more. In the fall, usually I'll put it right out in the garden, let it break down right in the garden over winter. If it's in the springtime, I don't usually want to add fresh manure right to plants I'm going to be growing, so I might let it break down in a big pile, but it breaks down very quickly. The other important thing about deep litter, which I didn't mention, is that it needs to be aerated in order to break down well. So what I do after a certain point, after a few months of letting them kind of do their thing, I'll come in there with a fork or a shovel and just turn that whole pile, just the deep litter, I'll turn it to aerate it a little bit, and that really speeds up the process. It also creates a lot of heat, which in the winter is great because it basically means that they're able to warm themselves up just from the compost that they're creating by pooping and peeing in place. So it's an incredible way of warming them by their own waste material. Really, really cool way of keeping them warm.
If a foot deep seems a little bit too deep for some people, would you need, and you decided you wanted to clear it out and put new down sooner, would you need to put that into your compost bin to sit for a while?
Right. Yeah, there are different methods aside from deep litter. Some people empty their, clean their coops out very regularly, once a month or so. Some people even do it every day, which I think is a little crazy. But yes, if you're going to take it out more often, then yeah, put it in a compost bin, just pile it up somewhere, let it break down, and after about 3 months, usually it'll be ready to go out. It'll look like soil at that point, and you can put it out wherever you want some extra fertility. Great question. So I wanted to show you guys our meat birds here, our layers. Ooh, it looks like they need some water. They need some water. So they are in a chicken tractor right now. This is something that I built with my partner. We just finished it this week. It's basically a mobile chicken coop. And the reason that we're doing this method is that we want to be able to move them around our backyard so that they can forage and lay down fertility all over. They're not going to completely reduce the amount, like they're not going to defoliate, but they are going to get a lot of food from the grass and the clover and the bugs that they can access. And I'm also fertilizing as we go. We're in an area of my yard that we're eventually going to be converting into garden space, but right now it's just sort of a wild lawn. I haven't actually mowed that here at all yet. So they're doing a lot of the mowing for me. And you can see they're a lot bigger. These birds are the same age as the laying hens, but about 3 times the weight and size, because they are incredibly good at eating and growing and pooping. So they're great at that. I'm offering them the same feed, by the way, as the laying hens. Once they reach about 6 weeks of age, I'm gonna transition their feed to what's called a finisher feed. It's got a little bit more fat in it, and that will help kind of get them ready for their final days. And yes, we are going to slaughter them at home with care and love, but we are planning to eat these birds, and that's part of the process for us. In order for us to really feel good about the meat that we are eating, we really wanted to raise our own birds, which not only makes sure that they are raised in humane conditions, and are able to really create healthy soil in that process. It also reduces the cost for us because organic, free-range, local birds are expensive. So this is a way of saving some money and also giving us some experience. Not to mention the fact that they are fertilizing our soon-to-be garden. So I'm going to give them some extremely rough compost that's not even fully broken down. This is all of our kitchen scraps. And I'm just going to kind of lay over here. And they just absolutely love this stuff. Let's see, they're a little shy right now, but I bet in a few minutes they're going to come over here and they're going to scratch. They're going to look for worms. They're going to eat any leftover food in there. They're going to love this stuff. So it's a great way of kind of spreading that fertility. And there's some great resources online on how to make compost using chickens. So if you don't want to create compost heaps at home, you could just do it with chickens. That's their natural behavior. Just eat food scraps and to make it into essentially really high quality fertility soil. So let's just step back here. I want to just, yeah, great. Let's help.
Is there any kitchen scraps that are not recommended for chickens?
That is a great question. There are some, yes. So in general, for laying hens, it's not recommended that you feed any onions or garlic or anything else in that allium family. They tend to create strong flavors in the eggs as well. It's also not recommended to feed them eggshells because if you do, they could actually start to eat their own eggs, believe it or not. Chickens are truly omnivorous. If they start to get into the habit of eating eggs, they will go after other eggs that are just hatched. You don't want to give them eggshells. And now some people say that you're not supposed to give them avocado. And to be honest, I don't know why. I've given them avocado. They seem to like it. But it might be worth doing some research as to why to not give them avocado. The other thing some people say not to give them is yeasted products. And again, I give them yeasted products all the time. Certainly have, when I've had older hens, and they did fine with that. I think if you give them too much yeast, it could create some health issues for them. But if you give them that in a balanced diet, totally fine. Citrus is another one that's not often recommended. But I think, again, if you give them small amounts, they'll be perfectly fine. Everything else, they will go after. They'll even eat meat, fish, all sorts of things. Oily food, whatever you give them. So you can see there, they're actually going after that compost. They're going to scratch it. They're going to work it into the soil. They're going to find all sorts of nutrition. And they're going to be quite happy. And you can see we've got two different kinds of watering systems. We've got one that has a little nipple on it, which they can just access from up top. I also do usually fill this up with water just to have some reserve because they go after a lot of water when it's this hot outside. So at this point, they're pretty self-sufficient. All I do is I move them whenever I want to give them new space for more forage, for more fertility expansion around our yard. So this is set up with a couple wheels on the back, sitting on some PVC piping to help it move. And I've got a handle in the front, and I just drag the whole thing. I'm not going to do it right now, but every few days, you could just pick this up, drag the whole thing, and they don't mind that one bit. I could also just leave them right here, and eventually they will eat all of grass and weeds. And at that point, you'll have a completely empty space. So if you're thinking of starting a garden and you don't want to do all the hard work of removing all the plants and digging, just leave chickens there for a week or two. They'll do the job for you, I promise. And you'll have a ton of fertility to start with. So that's a great passive way of letting chickens do their chicken thing while also benefiting from their work. That's very much in the permaculture method, right? Using biological resources before we use mechanical resources or our own labor. They benefit, we benefit from that kind of a system. So that's our meat bird system. Notice, by the way, we haven't talked about predators much. That's a really important topic that we can just touch on right now. This particular chicken tractor is enclosed on all sides. That's crucial because we have predators around. We have hawks, we have raccoons, we have skunks, we have rodents of different kinds. We have bobcats even. We have foxes. They all love chicken just as much as we do. So protect your birds. This is one way of doing that, and I want to show you one other way, which what we're going to be using for our laying hens as soon as they're ready to go outside. They're still a little bit too young. We're going to start introducing to the outdoors very soon, but right now they're a little bit too scared. So we're coming over here. This is our chicken run. It is enclosed with chicken wire on all sides. Chicken wire is easily, you can find it at most hardware stores. This is about 4 feet tall, and they can't really fly over this. Usually they would want to land on top if they want to get over, but they can't really get up over this anyway. The one thing that I want to point out, which we haven't done yet, is if you want to keep predator control from burrowing, let's say raccoons or even foxes, they will go right underneath this if you don't bury this. Or the other option, you don't want to bury your fencing, is to attach a piece or just kind of snake it along the bottom. Because what they usually want to do is try to dig right up next to the fence. So if you have chicken wire along the bottom, coming out about 2 feet or so, they won't recognize that they can just dig from even further out. They'll try a few times and they'll give up. So you have to have something on the bottom, either at least 6 inches or coming out a couple feet along the bottom. So I'm going to be adding that piece very soon along the bottom here, attaching it here, so that I don't have to worry about burrowing animals coming in and going after our chickens. Now above, we're worried about a lot of hawks, and the simplest method is actually, so some people will actually put chicken wire or roofing over it. That's fine, that works great, but an easier solution, which I find works great, is to just put something, wire or twine, that's easily visible, that the hawks won't want to fly through. Hawks usually want to come right down and swoop, grab a bird, and get out of there. They really need that element of surprise in order to get a chicken. So what we did is just strung some parachute cord back and forth here so that hawks don't come through here, because hawks don't want to get tangled. So if you have kind of a mesh of some kind, wires, they won't want to fly through there. So that is a really simple way of keeping hawks out. We're going to see how it works pretty soon, but I've tried it before. It works really great. The other thing I do recommend is having somewhere.
We're almost out of time.
Okay, great. I'm sorry?
I said we're almost out of time. Is there any kind of last, we're actually out of time. So we don't have any other questions coming in, but if you have any last thoughts.
Yeah, I would just share that it's really easy to keep chickens. And, since especially we're around our house nowadays quite a bit, it's extremely rewarding to produce your own food, to create real food security for yourself and your family, and to really just have this relationship with another animal. They really are not only our pets, they're our food producers, they're our food scrap recyclers. So there's such multi-purpose animals, and in order to really minimize the amount of industrial factory farming, there's no better way than either keeping your own chickens. If you can't do that, certainly supporting a local farm that's doing it right is a great way of doing that. I highly recommend you give it a try. It's really easy. There's a ton of great resources. I'm going to send a few around after this Zoom session is over. So give it a try, and I really promise you're going to have a great time. You'll have a lot of stories to tell your friends. You'll have some really good food to put on your table.
Great. We just have a couple of last questions. One is, how do you wash your eggs?
Oh, great question. I don't wash my eggs, and there's a good reason I don't do that. If you wash your egg, you actually are reducing its ability to store well. Eggs have a natural way of storing. You can actually store eggs outside of the refrigerator for several weeks in a perfectly healthy way. Don't tell that to the food safety folks because they will complain. But honestly, I've done it for years, and it is perfectly safe. People do it all around the world. But once you wash your egg, must refrigerate. Absolutely must refrigerate. If it's got, you know, a lot of poop on it, I do wash it off before I start to cook with it. But I don't wash them while I'm storing them. And I just use a very light brush, or I'll even just use my fingers sometimes. But honestly, I have not ever encountered any health issues. I've been eating unwashed eggs for years and years, never ever gotten sick. In fact, almost all salmonella outbreaks that have ever occurred in this country and elsewhere around the world have come from factory farm chickens, not from small flocks. So if people complain to you about potential disease issues, and let them know those are from industrial chickens. Small flocks, if cared for well, do not pose disease issues.
Great, thank you.
Great question.
And then one final question, will you eat your chickens after they stop laying?
Yes, wonderful question. We do plan to, yeah. So every year after year 1 of a chicken's laying life, so again, they start laying at 5 months. So from 5 months to 17 months, that's that first year cycle, they're gonna lay a lot of eggs. That's their best year of laying. Every year after that, they're gonna lay 20% less eggs than they did that first year. So really the economics of it turns out that about 3 to 5 years is when you're able to produce eggs at more or less, let's say, not a profit, but at a way that's sustainable economically. After that, they're not laying that many eggs. So we're going to keep our chickens for about 3 to 5 years. We'll see how attached we are to them. And at that point, they are going to be perfectly edible, but they're tough. So they're stewing chickens. You need to cook them for a long time. They're incredibly nutritious at that point. You require long cooking. So they go into soup or stew. They're delicious. But yes, you do want to cull them unless you want to keep them around as pets. And that's perfectly fine. But just understand that they're going to lay fewer and fewer eggs every year. And chickens can live 10 years. The most I think that anyone's ever recorded a chicken's life is 25 years. So, but 10 years is about the maximum usually people see, but they're not going to be laying much for those last 5 years. So it's your personal decision how you want to keep them. Just recognize that every year you're going to have less. So there's going to be more feed costs and less eggs for you.
Great, great. Thank you. And thank you so much for sharing all of this information, but also sharing what you're working on at your house. This has been really, really great. And thank you to Tyler, who's there on the other side of the camera. And thanks everybody for joining us.